Welcome and thank you so much for joining our conversation with Alice George, author of The Last American Hero, The Remarkable Life of John Glenn. We are excited to partner with the John Glenn College of Public Affairs for this event. In addition to being the home to John Glenn's spirit of public service, the Glenn College also has on display a number of artifacts from the John Glenn archives. And someday soon, we look forward to being able to view all of those wonderful items with you together. But until then, we're excited and thrilled to discuss the new biography on John Glenn with author Alice George. But before I introduce Dr. George, I just wanted to briefly go over some housekeeping. You'll notice that your audio and video are muted for this webinar. If you would like to ask Dr. George a question today, please use the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. The chat box is for general comments and discussions. Today's session is being recorded, so for future viewing, and attendees will be emailed a link to the recording within the next week or so. And I believe you'll also be able to find this recording on the Ohio State Library's YouTube channel. So now that that is out of the way, I am excited to introduce our guest. Dr. Alice George is an independent historian with a special interest in America during the 1960s. She has authored or co-authored 8 books, primarily focusing on 20th century American history or Philadelphia history. She earned her PhD in history from Temple University, a Master's of Liberal Arts from the University of Pennsylvania, and a bachelor's from Dickinson College. She is currently a regular contributor to the Smithsonian Magazine's online edition. And prior to becoming a historian, she was a senior editor at the Charlotte News, the Lexington Herald Leader, the Detroit Free Press, and the Philadelphia Daily News. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you, Carly. I love to talk about John Glenn. His life was extraordinary, and it would have been a remarkable life even if he'd never been a senator or an astronaut. I'll give you a few examples. He met his wife in a playpen when they were both toddlers. They started going steady in junior high. He never dated another woman, and they had a happy relationship of more than 80 years. And during World War II, when he was a Marine pilot, he had the opportunity to work side by side with Charles Lindbergh, his childhood hero. And in Korea, his frequent wingman was baseball star Ted Williams. He flew 149 successful missions in the 2 wars, including downing 3 Soviet-made MiGs during the last 9 days of the Korean War. In the 1950s, he set a world record for flying from Los Angeles to New York. And he appeared on the TV quiz show Name That Tune and won the top prize. Obviously, he had a full life even before NASA put out its request for test pilots to become astronauts. He applied like hundreds of other test pilots, and after a long list of grueling and painful exams, he was chosen to be one of the Mercury 7 astronauts. At that time, space was a Cold War battlefield where astronauts served as our avatars. Unfortunately for the United States at that time, the Soviet Union was ahead in terms of making big impressions. They had launched the first man-made satellite in 1957, and shortly afterward actually launched a dog into space. The dog only lived a few hours, but that was something else they beat us to. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, making his flight about a month before the United States was ready to launch Alan Shepard. Shepard and Gus Grissom, who were the first two astronauts, both had short 15-minute flights in which they basically just went up and came back down again. These flights were too short for Americans to really start relating to the astronauts. But when it came time for John Glenn to go into space, he was going to be up there for 4.5 hours, making 3 Earth orbits. And Americans were excited about this and the opportunity to relate to him. Communications technology at that time made this a lot easier. Transistor radios and portable TVs were relatively new devices that were common throughout the country. So millions of people were able to carry John Glenn with them to work or to school or wherever they had to go. And so they watched every minute. They saw the liftoff. They heard his voice during the flight. And they even at times heard his heartbeat. And that was fantastic. In Grand Central Station in New York, there was a 25-foot by 25-foot TV screen that had a crowd in front of it all day long. Sometimes the crowd was as big as 7,000 people. And despite the size of the crowd, CBS News reported that during the countdown, you could hear a pin drop. Americans really became part of John Glenn's team. And they were fascinated because his flight was in many ways a mystery. American scientists didn't know whether men could actually operate machinery in space. They didn't know whether weightlessness would distort their eyeballs and make them unable to see. They didn't even know if men could swallow in space. So we had a president of the United States who had already made a commitment to send men to the moon, but we didn't know if men could eat in space. So all these mysteries were there to be uncovered during John Glenn's flight. And that made John Glenn a true explorer, because before he started, we didn't know the answers to any of these questions. And after his flight, we knew all the answers. Americans found the whole thing thrilling, and they were even more impressed when they learned later that Glenn had been told shortly before his re-entry that the heat shield on his capsule might be loose and the capsule might burn up in the atmosphere. And the sound of the recording in which this conversation went on showed that Glenn was so cool. It was just okay. He had no emotional reaction at all. When he returned to Earth and to the United States, he found a country that was just overflowing with John Glenn fever. Glenn wowed politicians on Capitol Hill by speaking to a joint meeting of Congress, and he was the star of one of the biggest ticker tape parades ever in New York City. And he was totally baffled by the people's reaction, which is interesting coming from a man who had just seen 4 sunsets in one day and taken it well in stride. He's suddenly baffled by why he has so many fans. And in a way, that attitude made him even more popular because he did not seem to be taken away by fame. He did not lose the essence of what he was as a small town boy from Ohio. Glenn, of course, wanted to go back into space, and he was really frustrated because NASA kept saying, no, we want you to go into management. And he didn't want to go into management. He wanted to fly. At the time, he didn't know that the reason that he was being kept on the ground was because JFK had told NASA he thought that Glenn was too valuable an asset as an American hero to risk his life again. So Glenn decided to leave NASA and the Marine Corps, but his life became no less interesting. He became close friends with Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, who decided to run for president and campaign for the Democratic nomination in 1968. Glenn was at his side much of the time. They sometimes appeared together, they sometimes spoke at separate events, but it gave Glenn a real sense of politics and drama on the big stage. Sadly, Glenn was watching TV on the night of RFK's victory in the California primary and heard the gunshots that gravely injured his friend. When Glenn rushed to the hospital, Ethel Kennedy, who was then carrying her 10th child, asked the Glenns to pick up 5 of her children who were at the Beverly Hills Hotel and take them back to their home, Hickory Hill in Northern Virginia. The next morning, John Glenn and a neighbor sat down with each child and delivered the news that their father had died overnight. Afterwards, Glenn was a pallbearer in the funeral, and he became the head of a gun control organization and tried to get gun control legislation through Congress. A bill did pass, didn't have terrific impact, but that was his first taste of really being a national leader and pushing something, trying to get his issue adopted. He ran twice for the Senate from Ohio, unsuccessfully, before he won in 1974. And in 1980, when he ran for re-election, his margin of victory was so huge that he began to think about running for president. And he did decide to do that in 1984. His campaign was chaotic, it was inefficient, strategy was strange, and he said later he felt like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. He pulled out of the race fairly early in the primary season and left with a debt of more than $3 million. In the Senate, he continued to pursue issues that his staff laughingly called "my eyes glaze over" issues. Things like nuclear non-proliferation and efficiency in government. And while these issues would excite very few people, he still managed to do something that no one from Ohio had ever done before. He won 4 consecutive terms in the Senate. In 1998, he announced that he would not seek re-election. He was 77, and you might think that he would be ready to take a break and rest, but instead, NASA announced that he was going back to space. he had convinced NASA officials that would be worthwhile to compare the effects of aging with the effects of weightlessness. So they placed him on the shuttle Discovery with 6 other astronauts for a 9-day mission, and he loved it. In the last 18 years of his life, he headed one government commission and he served on another. He lent his name to the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State, and he loved any opportunity to interact with students there. And when he died at 95 in 2016, every headline after headline, called him a hero. And that really struck me because we live in a very cynical age. In 2016 was a year when people were very cynical and very outspoken about it. And during this cynical age, our only heroes seem to be athletes or comic book superheroes who are personified in films or on TV. John Glenn had no superpowers. He was a regular guy like any of us. He made mistakes, but still the label of hero stuck to him for more than half a century. For more than half a century, he signed autographs for people who just wanted to hold a piece of paper that had his name on it. I think that says a lot about the man and the nation. And I'm just really happy to have the opportunity to tell his fascinating story, because it's one that I think the American public should know.
Thank you so much, Alice. We're thrilled that you were able to tell this story as well. And I think, as many of us here know, earlier this week was the anniversary of Senator Glenn's passing. And of course, we're still mourning Annie Glenn, who passed away earlier this spring. So this conversation just feels like a really nice way to honor both of their memories. And thank you for being here today to help us to do that. So I see some questions coming in the chat. That's great. Keep putting them in there. I'm going to start with some of my own, and then we'll move to audience Q&A in a little bit. But I guess I would like to know, what drew you to John Glenn as a historical figure and made you want to write this book?
Well, I think it all started in 1962 when he made his Mercury flight, and I was a 4th grader, and they brought as many students as they could fit into the school auditorium, and then had a tiny portable black and white TV up at the front and put it on the stage, and we all tried to see him and to get a sense of what was going on. And I've always been interested in the space program, and of course he remains the most memorable astronaut. The one he has exceeded Neil Armstrong, not mostly because Neil Armstrong never wanted to be that person, and John Glenn just naturally fit into that hero image. And I do think part of what got me into it was thinking about the fact that he was still considered a hero, and how long his appeal had been, and how much people thought of him.
One thing that, and I should mention, I'll be scrolling through a few images as we kind of go through this Q&A section. But one thing that really struck me about the book was how closely the concept of hero tied to Glenn's curiosity, and how that curiosity really seemed to be a defining characteristic of him as a person, and it seemed to motivate so many aspects of his life, but so many decisions that he made throughout his life, whether that was, his military service or the Project Bullet flight, or even, his eagerness to go into space. Can you speak a little bit about how this curiosity seemed to inform John Glenn, the hero, but also John Glenn, the boy from Ohio?
Yes, he really believed strongly that curiosity was what had made the United States a great nation. And it was one of his biggest traits. He argued that it was important for everyone to keep the curiosity of their childhood and to ask questions and to try new things. One of the things that he did that really struck me as a sign of his curiosity was that when he was briefly stationed in China after World War II, he asked the military police if he could go with them into an opium den. And this was just something he was curious about. And he came away with a lot of respect to the police, and he knew that they regularly went through the opium dens to make sure there weren't American military men in there. But he wanted to know, so he did that. He also for fun, in World War II, he traveled in a submarine just because he wanted to see what that was like. And later, after the war, he drove a tank one time just because he happened to be somewhere where when he was still in the Marines, where somebody said, "You want to drive the tank?" And he, of course, wanted to do that. And I think that was always a big motivation for him, and it really shaped the way he viewed American history and the way he thought that Americans should be educated. And I think that's really great to have a college named after him, that follows those, allows that message to still get out.
Yeah, mentioning the college, so much of his writing around the time of his retirement from the Senate really talked about that the goal of something like a college or a program, and the goal to dispel apathy or mistrust and cynicism of the youth. And I have to think that's an extension of that characteristic of curiosity, and it has to do with a lot with what the John Glenn College has become, but also the donation of his archives too. He wants to provide access to a new generation of curious minds, and I think that's just such a nice legacy that he leaves us. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that Senator Glenn was not known for pursuing snazzy or glamorous issues. Almost famously, he works on some of this legislation that maybe some might consider dull, but nevertheless critically important to how our government works and how we work internationally. And I think what's an important distinction in some of your coverage of his political career, you noted that he excelled in the arena of public service, but perhaps not so much as a politician. And can you speak to these kind of competing archetypes of Glenn, the Cold War hero, and then Glenn, really the everyman in the Senate?
He was very interesting as a senator because he didn't shy away from taking stands. And at times he was actually criticized for being too stubborn, but he was true to his inner beliefs as much as he could be. And so, for instance, he had trouble getting along with Jimmy Carter, who was president from his own party, but he felt Carter was doing some things wrong, and so he stood by that and did that. And I think that was part of his upbringing his parents had a big effect on him. I think he lived his whole life in a way that his parents would have been proud to know that that's how he acted and that's what he achieved.
Now, I know that you drew a lot of source material from different archives, including our archives here at Ohio State. I'm really curious, because I'm an archivist, if you could just explain your approach to archival research, especially when looking at a project this size and with material so geographically distributed. I have to assume that was kind of a big challenge.
It was, and you really have to, especially if you're traveling to do research, you have to make the most of your time. And I did research there, as well as I did research in Fort Worth at the National Archives, and I did research at the John F. Kennedy Library, and I even did research at the Paley Institute for Media, which is I watched 9 hours of Walter Cronkite's coverage of Glenn's flight, which was almost funny to watch. But in an archive, you have hundreds of boxes that you could go through and look at every single item. And there's just not time for that, or there's not time to really study every item. You can look at them and in some cases, and so my technique, which may be a little old-fashioned, I have found that doing digital records by using my phone to take a picture of the document actually seems more time consuming than asking for Xeroxes of the document. So what I do is I go through boxes very fast, and I choose things that look likely to be useful and have them copied. And then later, when I get home and I get the photocopies, then I can go through and really study them closely and figure out what is the most useful. One real issue in your John Glenn archives is the Senate papers. There are so many boxes of Senate papers. I think I went through every box of the non-Senate papers, which was more than 100 boxes, but the Senate papers are I think they're like 500 boxes or something like that. And
578.
Okay. And so what I had to do with the Senate papers was to do research elsewhere to figure out which issues were important to him and which time periods I should focus on, because there was no way I could look in all of those boxes. So you really do have to be strategic about it.
Yeah, it is a quite a puzzle to kind of look at the time you have and the boxes that you have to get through and what your goals are. So reading your book and looking at your bibliography, you did use oral histories that John and Annie Glenn both conducted with interviewers here at Ohio State, but also at other institutions. So did the audio or transcripts of these oral histories really help you find John Glenn's voice? And can you talk about how that might have helped you understand his life and his personality?
I think that they were a very important source to me, because I could see in his own words how he felt about things. For instance, his comment about the presidential campaign, that he was tilting at windmills. That was not something that I think he ever said in a speech, but just in sitting down and talking to one person, that was his honest reaction. I think oral histories are terrific, and I was fortunate because NASA had an oral history collection. There were others, but he had done, I believe, is it 23 oral histories? Yes, and that pretty much covers his whole life. There are a few gaps, but for the most part, and he talked very openly, and I think he was hoping to use the oral histories to help him with a framework for his memoir. And so that helped me, that he was thinking about a book as he was doing the oral histories. And it was interesting to see he didn't use everything from the oral histories in his book, but they were a fascinating source, and I really appreciated them. And I think they're very helpful. And you know, the issue about JFK not wanting him to fly again, actually an interviewer who was interviewing Glenn at the Kennedy Library said, "Oh yes, I talked to the president and he told me he didn't want you to go up again because you were such a hero." And it was like Glenn had never had any official explanation, and then he gets it while he's giving an oral history interview.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. Yeah, I think the oral histories are great. And then, you know, there are so many letters in our collection here that are just, you know, he was a prolific letter writer, and it's just such a thrill to have that little window into his thoughts. A lot of times he wrote poems, you know, it was just lovely to be able to have access to that kind of.
Yeah, the poems are great. The fact that he did the poems, and that several different times in his life, he kept a diary or he talked to a tape recorder. And that was really helpful too, because you got at the moment that he was experiencing it, you know, what kind of things he was thinking about.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to pivot over to our Q&A from the audience. So my last question here is, so we know that, you know, of course, John Glenn lived most of his life in the spotlight, but was there anything that you learned over the course of researching this book that surprised you, that you had never heard of about Senator Glenn?
I think the thing that surprised me the most was his relationship with Annie, and how deep that relationship was, and how early it started, and how what a pair they were together, what a force they were. I interviewed one of the astronauts on the shuttle flight with him, and he said that John and Annie didn't really have what you'd call a relationship, that it was much more interlinked than that, and that the two of them together were more than two people. And I thought that was a fascinating way to look at it. And it's interesting to see, you know, a public man whose private life obviously gave him such strong support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We have a lovely picture up now of John and Annie Glenn relaxing during the Senate campaign, which is, as we talked earlier, both one of our favorite photos. So I'm going to pivot now over to our Q&A. So the first question we have, what was the most difficult part of your research? The military aspect, the political, or the astronaut?
The astronaut was very challenging because NASA had moved all of the papers from the Mercury program to the National Archives, and there were so many boxes of documents, and I was afraid not to look at every single one. And they had, you know, sort of daily reports about how things were going, what the astronauts were learning, what they were seeing, and documents, you know, from the astronauts asking questions or requesting changes. And that was a very challenging research effort to do in a few days. And I really, I loved the fact that the records were available, but it was a challenge.
Yeah, just a bulk challenge of getting through all the material.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next person says, I've always been a huge fan of Senator Glenn. He was my favorite living American and the best person to model your life after. This person also enjoys the Right Stuff film and is curious about how accurate the portrayal of Glenn in the movie is to the real man. He's also curious about the current program, The Right Stuff, which is on the National Geographic Channel on Disney+. And if you can speak to how, or if that compares as much more as, how does that Glenn persona compare on the new Right Stuff?
Well, in the old Right Stuff, he came across, I think, as a little more of the ever vigilant Christian than he really was. I think he was a Christian, but he was not trying. He was he liked to have fun just like everybody else. And he was not the strict by the rules person. You know, he in fact at times got in trouble for breaking rules. And so I think that portrayal was a little bit stiff and didn't give him total credit for his more rounded personality. I did watch the more recent version, and they did, you know, they said at the beginning that this is based on real information, but it is a fictionalized version, and it definitely was. There were scenes in that I don't think have been in any factual books, but they held together the fictional version. And for instance, the issue of one of the astronauts being photographed with a woman and John Glenn managing to convince a newspaper publisher not to publish it on the grounds that it would violate national security. The scene in the more recent version showed that it was Alan Shepard, and that it showed the whole encounter of Alan Shepard coming to him and asking for help and everything. And I think I've read one account in which it was identified as Alan Shepard, but Glenn never identified who the other astronaut was. So I think there's always a little bit of fiction thrown in to draw the story together. I think the Glenn in the later version was more relaxed and was able to be one of the guys at times, which was good, because I think that was more realistic.
Right. And I think Glenn himself has said the first version of the Right Stuff was something that he didn't identify with. He didn't recognize himself in that.
Yes, that's right. And it came out in the year when he was running for president. So it was very weird, but he just did not think it was about him. He liked Tom Wolfe's book, but he didn't like it.
Yeah. I have not seen the Disney Plus version, but it is a vacation viewing. It's coming up soon.
Yeah.
So. Okay, so our next question, can you describe his departure from his first run for Senate? I recall he fell and hurt his head.
Yes, he was still in the Marine Corps at that point, and so he couldn't actively campaign, but he was starting to set up an operation to campaign, and he was in an apartment, and here you have the space hero, and he falls in the bathroom and ends up being put out of commission for about a year because he had chronic dizziness, and the doctors told him that if he wanted to get back to where he'd been before, that he would have to allocate a year of his life to treatment, and he did. And he pulled out of the Senate race as soon as the doctors made it clear to him that he was not going to be able to campaign.
Our next question, John Glenn certainly left a legacy, including the John Glenn College at OSU. You mentioned the $3 million campaign debt from his run for president. Did this ever get paid off?
What happened with that is that Glenn gave the maximum amount that a candidate can give. There's a ceiling above which the candidate is not supposed to go. And Glenn went back to the election commission and said, could you please let me give enough to pay off all the small vendors who lost money because of my campaign? And he was allowed to do that. And that still left a considerable debt at several banks, but that was written off over the course of the years.
So our next question is, what do you think qualifies him to be regarded as a hero? Which kind of went... Go ahead.
I think that he, all through his life, he volunteered. He volunteered for the Marine Corps right after Pearl Harbor, while he was in the service, whenever there was an option to try something new or to do something dangerous, he stepped forward and said, I'll do it. And that through his war service, some people thought he was reckless, but other people said, no, he's just willing to risk his own life to protect other people. And, the astronaut service was the same kind of thing. He said, we all know the risks, and yet we think it's worth taking. And, when you think back on the 7 original astronauts, one of the 7 died in a NASA accident. And it could very well have been more than one. So that was really a quite hazardous thing that he took on, and he took it on wholeheartedly. He wanted to be the first man in space, and Alan Shepard got to be the first American in space, but Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. But it ended up that Glenn's flight, because it was an orbital flight, it took some time, and because the technology allowed people to follow it minute by minute, he became a real center of attention and very widely admired because he kept the same attitude throughout his life, and he didn't become, boastful or anything like that. He was just a regular guy who a lot of things had happened to if you talk to him. And I think that's part of what makes him heroic, is that he didn't try to be heroic necessarily. He never aspired to that word, but he got it anyway.
Right. So we have a question here from a John Glenn College Master's graduate. And he says, Senator Glenn accomplished so much during his life, personally, professionally, and historically, and yet he seemed to never accept more than a pat on his back as far as praise. He was very selfless. What do you believe was his biggest motivation? Where do you believe this personality trait come from? And this person thinks he's 100% a role model.
Well, Glenn's father only had a 4th grade education, and yet he became a very successful businessman. He started off as a plumber, and then he opened a plumbing store, and then he opened a small car lot and sold cars. And I think Glenn always said that his father was his biggest influence in his life. And he just, he never bought into the idea that he was, bigger than anybody else. And one of the things that a lot of people comment on, if you read different accounts of his life, people who were close to him and who were with him when he traveled the world, commented that he spoke to a king and he spoke to a cab driver exactly the same way. He didn't have different ways of addressing different people. Everybody was the same to him. And it's funny, one of the other astronauts commented that back in the early 60s, he could sit down and have an intellectual discussion with a woman. And that was rare for a military man, but he was just a people person, and he just saw himself as one of the crowd.
Mm-hmm. I think when I of course have never met John Glenn. I arrived after his passing, but I've met many people who have, and everybody talks about that, whether they meet him because he waved to them walking across campus or they had a great conversation with him. That is just that sentiment is echoed over and over again here, and it is a real trait that he had. So our next question gets to these personality trait questions again. So what personality trait do you believe allowed him to excel in all these roles? Marine, astronaut, politician, was it his curiosity or his openness to new experiences?
I think it was a combination of his curiosity and discipline. He had to be disciplined in the military to be successful at all. And I think he always challenged himself his commander in World War II, when he was still training, said he's the kind of guy who is upset if he doesn't fly every day, because you know, even if he's just doing a relatively unimportant flight rather than a specific mission, he wants to be involved. He wants to do something every day. And I think that was a real driving force with him. And I think that's part of why he got deep into the dull subjects of the Senate, because it required discipline to do it. And he, even though he didn't graduate from college and get an engineering degree, he did a lot of engineering in space program and in his head. And I think he thought like an engineer and had the discipline necessary to do things exactly.
Great. So our next question is, how much time did it take to research this book? And how much time to write it? And how did you keep track of everything?
Well, it took about 3 years to research it and about a year to write it. I kept track of it because I have bibliographic software, and this is something most people don't know about or they don't hear about. But if I have one document, I have it in my computer, where it is. I have where I got it, what box, what archives, what box, what folder, and I have also where I put it in my files, so that if I later think, oh, I want to put it in that great document, but I don't remember where it was, I have a record of where it is. And that's a big help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you might not be able to choose, but what do you think was Glenn's greatest achievement?
Oh, that's difficult. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't even mention earlier, that I should have, that he was in fact the oldest person to ever fly in space, which is an achievement, and is something that's probably going to stand for a while, because NASA doesn't have any particular plans to send up old people. But I think I think the 1962 flight was the most impactful thing that he did, and its impact lasted for a long time. But I do think the fact that at 77 he could be in the shape to make a space flight and could do the kind of physical things that the astronauts are required to do, and they even insisted that he learn how to use a laptop, because they too busy a flight to have one person who didn't know how to do everything. And so he learned at 77 how to use a laptop.
I mean, spaceflight was completely different then. I mean, he was the only man before, and now he was on a team of people and could move around the cabin, and that must have been
yeah, I think it was totally different, and it was a great opportunity for him, because besides the work, he did work, but he had a lot of time to enjoy the view and to you know, to enjoy his co-workers. Although he did make a joke that he liked the guy who commanded the 62 flight, because he was a real regular guy, you know, and so it was different for him to be not to be up there alone, but I think he liked that.
Yeah. So this next question, I thought Glenn worked for Pepsi or some other large company. When did that happen, and what was his position?
He worked for Royal Crown Cola, which is I think originated in Georgia. It was definitely a southeastern company, and he started off as a board member, and then he was named as the head of its international operations. So this happened 65, 66, the late 60s. he's still doing it when he campaigned for Robert Kennedy, and some of his colleagues at Royal Crown weren't happy about his political role. But he did, when he was head of the international operation, he and Annie had an apartment in New York, but they spent most of the time traveling around the world, trying to find people who wanted to set up Royal Crown Cola factories. And so he went, you know, everywhere looking for places where the company could thrive. And I think it was a totally different experience for him in terms of the business side of it. But at the same time that he was doing that, traveling for Royal Crown Cola, he was still traveling for NASA as an advisor. And so he spent a great deal of the late 60s in other countries and on airplanes.
Well, it seems like traveling was something that he and Annie both enjoyed. And I'm going to jump to one question which reads, I've read accounts that John and Annie Glenn would just jump into their car and head out onto the road. Is this true? And did they ever did they ever stop their road trips?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, he had a private plane, and they flew up until they were in their 80s, and they reached the point where they both had such bad knees that they couldn't get onto the private plane to fly it. But I also have spoke to someone who helped them with the campaign in '92, who said that during that campaign, John and Annie drove all over Ohio. They didn't have somebody drive them. You know, they didn't have a lot of staff with them. They had this one guy who rode in the back seat and read newspapers the whole way. He was like getting a free ride. He wasn't really contributing anything. And that was what Glenn was comfortable doing, and he and Annie always liked to be together whenever they could. So that was a good way to campaign. And I do think that they lived their lives, you know, looking for adventures and fun things to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you know of his connection to Tom Brokaw? And did they, I think they did a program here at the Glenn College a number of years ago, but I'm not aware of any other connection, but are you?
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Yeah. Sorry, I think we can look back maybe in the Glenn College's events list and come up with that question, or answer to that question. So we do have one last question here, and it's relating to Annie Glenn. So Annie seems to have played a large role in supporting Senator Glenn in all roles of his life. And can you talk a little bit about that, how their relationship helped him navigate these aspects of his life?
Yes, you know, when the Mercury astronauts were first introduced to the public, they were all sitting at a big table, and the reporters were asking them questions, and John Glenn volunteered that I don't think any of us could be up here doing this if we didn't have the support of our wives and our families. And one of the other astronauts said right after that, well, what I do with my life is my business. My wife doesn't worry about it. And that really sort of set up the difference. And he really did depend on her support. He was, you know, and she was there to support him. I talked to people who worked in his Senate office who, you know, talked about what a great woman she was and how much she was around, and they got to know her. And the only thing that I know of that he did that she didn't really want him to was the space shuttle flight that she initially was. I think he said something understated, like not very happy, but I think she was really stunned by the idea that he would take another risk, because she had so many times stayed at home and worried about him while he was doing dangerous things, and now he was going to do it again when he was 77. And she eventually came around, and supported him on that. And NASA let her go with him through a lot of the training and to observe. And I think that helped a lot. But I do think that he said when he was in space the first time that he didn't have time to pray because he had so much to do. But he also said that while he was there, he kept thinking about Annie. And I think that's true. Annie was sort of his North Star.
Mm-hmm.
And when he got back to the United States after that flight and saw Annie, he cried openly, and then he sort of tried to hide it from the press, but everybody knew she was that important to him.
Sure. So we do have one more question that I think it's a really great question to end on. So what lessons can we apply from Senator Glenn's life to inspire and cultivate the next generation of John and Annie Glens?
Oh, that is a great question. I think it's really important to impress upon everyone how much we can do as individuals, how much we can contribute to society in whatever job that we're in. And I think public service, the kind of public service that John Glenn did, seems to be lost often now as we see politicians divided by party and not willing to reach across the aisle to do the right thing. And I think that Glenn's example would say, okay, stop that, start talking to each other, start getting these bills passed. And I think that his willingness to volunteer is tremendous, and it on the job, in the community, wherever, he was always happy to do whatever he could. I had to laugh because one of the women who worked in his office said, if somebody's car battery was dead, the senator was out there with his sleeves rolled up, jumping in the car because that was something he could do to help another person. And that's the kind of life.
Well, this has been so much fun, Alice. I wish we could keep talking, but we've hit our hour mark. So thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your process and your knowledge about this book. We're really thrilled to be able to talk with you. And I'd like to thank everybody else for joining us. In a few short days, you should receive a link of this recording that you can share or watch. We really appreciate you joining us. I'd also like to thank the John Glenn College and Gramercy Books for their partnership. And of course, I want to thank the Ohio State Library's events team, Cornetta Batts, Shannon Niedermeyer, Alicia Perkins. Thank you so much for helping everything run smoothly. I hope you all have a very safe and healthy holiday season. And yeah, we'll see you next time.